April 1945. A muddy makeshift prisoner of war processing center outside Frankfurt. A sudden, freezing spring downpour turns the entire camp into a deep, swirling pit of icy sludge. Several dozen captured German guards stand together on the only dry, elevated wooden walkway in the compound, keeping their feet clean and warm. Below them, a line of exhausted American medics struggles through knee-deep, freezing mud, carrying heavy wooden stretchers loaded with severely wounded American soldiers. The German guards watch the struggling medics. They laugh, smoke cigarettes, and refuse to step aside into the mud to let the medical evacuation pass. One American medic slips, nearly dropping a bleeding soldier into the freezing mire, causing the German officers above to chuckle louder. This behavior does not go unnoticed. General George S. Patton is currently inspecting the facility, and these laughing guards are about to face a lesson in humility they will never forget. This is the story of a cold spring day in Germany, when General George S. Patton encountered captured SS guards who refused to respect wounded American soldiers, and how he turned their unearned privilege into a brutal 10-mile lesson in reality. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Corporal David Miller was 19 years old. He came from Akron, Ohio, and served with the 3rd Army Medical Battalion. Before the war, he worked at a local tire manufacturing plant, helping his father support a family of 6. He enlisted the day after his 18th birthday, eager to do his part, but the realities of the European theater quickly stripped away his youth. He had seen the carnage of the Hurtgen forest and the frozen horrors of the Ardennes, losing his best friend to an artillery blast just 3 weeks prior. Now he was completely exhausted. His hands were covered in painful, weeping blisters from gripping wooden stretcher handles for days without sleep. His wool uniform was completely soaked through with a mixture of freezing rain and the blood of the dying men he desperately tried to keep alive. He was currently shivering in the downpour, struggling with every ounce of his remaining strength to keep a heavy canvas litter balanced as his boots sank deep into the sucking mud. Looking down at him from the dry walkway was Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Voss. Voss was a 41-year-old SS officer from Munich, raised in an old aristocratic family with a long tradition of military service. He remained a fanatical believer in the racial and cultural supremacy of the Reich, convinced that European civilization was being dismantled by undisciplined American tourists who had no business playing at war. Despite the chaotic collapse of the German front and the squalor of the processing camp, Voss maintained an immaculate appearance. His tailored black uniform showed no signs of wear. His tall leather riding boots were polished to a mirror shine, and a gleaming iron cross hung proudly at his neck. To him, the muddy Americans below were weak, inferior laborers who deserved no respect. He smiled faintly, adjusting his cap as the exhausted young corporal from Ohio stumbled in the freezing muck. By April 1945, the Allied advance into the heart of Germany had reached a frantic, overwhelming pace. The Western Front was no longer a single, coherent line of fortifications, but rather a chaotic network of rapidly moving armored columns carving through a collapsing nation. Millions of German soldiers were surrendering all at once, overwhelming the available logistical resources of the advancing Allied armies. Divisions were moving so fast that administrative units could barely keep up, forcing combat teams to establish makeshift processing centers in open fields and ruined towns. Pragroster across the region was utterly devastated, with broken supply lines, shattered railway networks, and destroyed bridges, turning simple transports into logistical nightmares. Medical battalions were under immense pressure, forced to handle both a steady stream of combat casualties and the sudden burden of thousands of enemy prisoners who required screening, food, and basic organization. In this environment of absolute exhaustion and operational chaos, many field commanders chose to look the other way when minor infractions occurred. Frontline officers were simply too tired to enforce strict protocol, allowing captured enemy personnel a degree of autonomy just to keep the camp system from grinding to a complete halt. It was common for senior German officers to maintain their internal ranks and privileges within the wire, as long as they kept their men compliant and orderly. Arrogance among the defeated was often tolerated by busy administrators who valued efficiency over discipline, leading some captive units to believe that their old authority remained intact despite their total defeat. This lax enforcement created a dangerous illusion of continued superiority among the fanatical remnants of the old regime. But that fragile illusion was about to be completely shattered by an officer who tolerated no compromise with the defeated enemy. An American medical battalion captain noticed the bottleneck near the center of the camp and walked quickly over to the wooden walkway. He wiped freezing rain from his eyes, looking up at the dry, elevated planks where the German officers stood. He addressed the German commander directly, keeping his voice firm and professional. "Please order your men to step down into the mud so my litter teams can get through to the triage tents." Voss did not look down. He adjusted the collar of his pristine uniform and stared straight ahead into the gray rain. "The wooden path is the only stable ground in this miserable place, and my men are officers of the Reich. We do not yield to laborers." The captain stepped closer, his boots sinking deeper into the freezing sludge. "These are severely wounded men on these stretchers, and they need immediate medical attention. Your personal comfort does not take priority over a medical evacuation. Step off the path now." Voss turned his head slightly, a cold smile touching his lips as he looked at the exhausted American medics struggling below him. "Your wounded tourists are not my concern, Captain. If your men are too weak to carry their burdens through a little mud, that merely proves what we have always known about your army. You are undisciplined, soft, and entirely unsuited for war. We will remain on the dry path." The captain felt his hands clench into fists inside his wet wool gloves. He took a deep breath to steady his voice, citing the direct regulations governing the processing of captured enemy personnel. "You are prisoners of war under our jurisdiction, and you will obey a direct order from an American officer. Step down into the mud immediately or face severe disciplinary action." Voss laughed softly, tapping his polished leather boot against the wooden planks. "You have no authority to degrade us. We are superior soldiers, even in defeat, and we will not humiliate ourselves by wallowing in the dirt for the sake of your inferior casualties. Do what you must, but we are staying right here." The captain realized this crossed a line far beyond a simple dispute over camp space. The blatant insubordination and the cruel mockery of dying men required immediate, high-level intervention. He turned away from the walkway and looked toward the command tent, knowing exactly who was currently inspecting the western sector of the compound. He walked rapidly to the communication line to report the incident up the chain of command. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top command jeep splashed heavily through the deep mire, pulling up right alongside the elevated wooden walkway. The 3-inch steel air horns mounted on the hood were silent, but everyone in the compound registered his presence instantly. The general stepped out into the freezing downpour, his posture perfectly rigid. A high-polished helmet bore 4 gleaming silver stars, matched by the stars on his shoulder straps. His tailored wool overcoat was buttoned tightly against the wind, and the famous ivory-handled revolvers rested in their leather holsters at his hips. The American medics stopped in their tracks, still holding the heavy stretchers in the mud. The German prisoners on the wooden planks stiffened, their casual laughter dying out instantly. Patton did not raise his voice. His tone was cold, precise, and completely controlled as he walked directly toward the immaculate SS officer. Patton studied him. He looked at the polished leather boots, the clean uniform, and the gleaming iron cross before speaking. "Are you the senior officer in charge of this captive detachment?" Voss stepped forward, clicking his heels together on the dry wood. "I am Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Voss, commanding officer of this group. Did you order your men to block this wooden path and force our medical teams into the mud?" "I did not issue a formal order, General, but we chose to retain the dry ground because we are professional soldiers, not laborers." "And you believe your status as professional soldiers exempts you from the basic laws of humanity? We are officers of the Reich, and we refuse to humiliate ourselves in the muck for the sake of wounded inferiors who cannot carry their own weight. Patton stood perfectly still in the rain. You stand on those dry boards and speak of military honor as if you still command an empire. You look at your polished boots and your tailored wool, and you think the old rules of your broken hierarchy still protect you from the reality of your defeat. The reality is that your empire is gone. Your armies are retreating in absolute chaos. Your cities are in ruins, and your leaders are hiding in underground bunkers, while young men die to cover their escape. You are not a ruling elite. You are a captured enemy. Below you in the mud stands a 19-year-old corporal from Akron, Ohio. He has spent the last 3 days without a single hour of sleep, lifting heavy canvas litters and wading through freezing sludge to save human lives. His hands are covered in bleeding blisters, and his uniform is soaked in the blood of his comrades. He is twice the soldier you will ever be. You believe the mud is beneath your dignity. You believe that your polished leather entitles you to watch better men struggle while you smoke cigarettes and laugh at their suffering. You have forgotten what it means to earn respect. You now have a choice. You can step down into that freezing mire right now, stand before those exhausted medics, and offer a full, formal apology for your insubordination. Or you can face immediate military justice for actively interfering with the medical evacuation of wounded soldiers. Decide now. Voss drew himself up to his full height, his face turning pale with absolute fury. He stared directly over Patton's shoulder, his jaw tightly clenched. I am an officer of the German army. I will never humiliate myself by apologizing to a common laborer from Ohio, and I will not step into the dirt for your weak casualties. Patton did not argue. He simply turned to his military police escort and nodded once. The American MPs stepped onto the wooden walkway, grabbed Voss by his clean wool shoulders, and forced him down into the knee-deep, freezing sludge. They stripped the polished leather riding boots from his feet, pulling off his thick, dry wool socks until he stood barefoot in the icy mire. The other German guards were immediately ordered down off the planks, their own footwear and socks removed in the exact same manner. The crowd of watching prisoners fell into an absolute, stunned silence as the arrogant officers sank into the gray muck. Patton then ordered the barefoot Germans to take the heavy wooden stretcher handles directly from the blistered hands of the American medics. Voss was forced to shoulder the heaviest canvas litter, his bare feet turning instantly blue as they sank into the freezing, jagged stones at the bottom of the mud pit. The general ordered the detachment to carry the wounded American casualties for the next 10 miles to the field hospital, while Corporal Miller and the exhausted medical teams marched on the dry walkway. American guards with rifles lined the path, ensuring the prisoners kept moving through the bitter rain. Corporal David Miller survived the war and returned home to Akron, Ohio, in the autumn of 1945. His blistered hands eventually healed, though the skin remained permanently scarred from the brutal friction of the wooden litter handles. He went back to work at the tire manufacturing plant, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised a family of 4 children in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He rarely spoke about his experiences in the European theater, preferring to focus entirely on the peaceful routine of his civilian life. However, he kept his old, mud-stained medical dog tags hanging on a small brass hook inside his workshop for the rest of his days, serving as a silent testament to the moment his burden was eased. He lived a long, productive life and passed away peacefully in his sleep in July 1994. Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Voss did not fare well after the total collapse of the Reich. Following his delivery of the wounded Americans to the field hospital, he was placed into strict solitary confinement and thoroughly investigated by army prosecutors. He was eventually transferred to a formal war crimes tribunal, where his fanatical record and harsh treatment of Allied personnel resulted in a 15-year prison sentence. He served his time in a military prison before being released in the late 1950s, returning to a shattered and reconstructed Germany. He lived out his remaining years in absolute obscurity and growing bitterness, unable to accept the total destruction of his old world. He died in Munich in 1972. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident in his public briefings, choosing to keep the official report filed away in the bottom drawer of his field desk. He only referenced the cold day outside Frankfurt once, writing a short, handwritten note to a close friend back in the United States. He noted that some men need to be reminded of their defeat through the soles of their bare feet. Some historians have argued that General Patton's heavy-handed approach at the Frankfurt processing camp crossed the line into arbitrary, unconventional punishment, violating the expected professional boundaries of a theater commander. They contend that stripping foreign officers of their uniform items and forcing a barefoot march risked undermining the formal legal structure established by international conventions for treating captured enemy personnel. Others have argued the opposite, defending the action as a brilliant and necessary application of frontline psychological warfare. These scholars maintain that confronting the unrepentant arrogance of fanatical elements was absolutely crucial for establishing order in a collapsing nation, forcing defeated zealots to immediately face the reality of their complete loss. What is certain is that Patton's decisive intervention sent a clear, uncompromised message through the ranks of both armies that the old rules of unearned privilege were officially over. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply ordered a formal reprimand from the safety of the command tent? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.